Welcome, everyone. I'm Jeremy Wiederhorn, Rabbi at TCS, and I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Michael Friedman, Rabbi at Temple Israel. And we have a very special guest this evening that we'll introduce in just a moment. This is a tremendous partnership that Rabbi Friedman and I are proud to continue tonight. There have been many opportunities over the past several years in which we've come together for important conversations like this. And I know that I can speak for both of us that we really cherish our relationship and the ways in which the two congregations have come together. Do want to thank Karen Savell from the Federation of Greater Fairfield County for her support in partnering as well in promoting this throughout the community so that we can have as many people throughout Fairfield County involved in this particular discussion and timely conversation tonight. It's really, I also want to thank Shelley Casson, our mutual friend on all three of us, and who really inspired us to get together right now at this time to have this conversation. We've been trying to bring Danny together back to, he's been in our community many times, but she's been the force behind the scenes who really made it happen this time. So we want to thank Shelley as always for your friendship and for all that you do for the Jewish world, frankly. Here we go. It is really my honor to introduce a teacher, a friend, a colleague, a mentor, Daniel Gordis, who I hopefully can call Danny tonight. He is the Koret Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College. He's the author of 13 books, one of which I actually had the honor of working with him on back when I was in rabbinical school, Does the World Need the Jews? He now has a really phenomenal podcast. If you're not familiar with it, it's called Israel from the Inside. Certainly encourage you to check that out at some point. His history of Israel, a Concise History of a Nation Reborn, received the 2016 National Jewish Book Award as the Book of the Year. It is certainly an important resource for anyone who wants to have a go-to book on Israel. And just this week, his most recent book, Impossible Takes Longer, 75 years after its creation, Has Israel Fulfilled Its Founders' Dreams, just came out this past week. And so I have a feeling we'll hear a little bit about that as well. But more specifically, last night, hundreds of thousands of Israelis were back on the streets again, protesting the proposed judicial overhaul of the current government coalition, and we'd like to hear a little bit, from Danny about, what is this all about? How did we get here? And can we get out? So I'm going to stop talking and pass it over to him because I know everyone's here to hear him tonight. So Danny.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Michael, both of you, for inviting me to do this with both of you and your communities. I'll just say from afar that it's really wonderful to see congregations like this partnering. Our shared destinies are obvious, and therefore our work together should be equally obvious, but it's not always obvious. And so the fact that you and your communities do what you do is really actually very inspiring.
If I could just interrupt for one quick second before you start, one thing I forgot to say was that while Danny is speaking, if you have questions, please send them in the chat to either Rabbi Friedman or myself, and we'll sort through them. And when he's finished speaking, we're going to be together about an hour this evening. And so towards the latter part of this hour, we'll go to some of your questions. And so just feel free to send them over to either one of us, to either Rabbi Friedman or myself. And we will try to get to as many as we can. Thank you.
Great. So I was just saying that I think it's really wonderful that these congregations work together the way that they do. It's actually a model for what the Jewish world needs to try to replicate. So it makes it even more of an honorary part of this. And I also wanted to join with Jeremy and Michael in thanking Shelley Casson. Shelley and Michael have been friends for many, many, many years. We've seen their leadership role in the Jewish world writ large, up front and very close up over many, many years. And so I just want to thank Shelley also for her work in getting this afternoon scheduled. We're going to go tomorrow night into Yom HaShoah, which is the Memorial Day for victims of the Holocaust. And I just will begin by mentioning something about that. It seems kind of that you can't not say something about it with it looming so large on the horizon. And in Israel, it's already, the news is already all about it. We tell a story as American Jews and as Israeli Jews, and obviously between Israel and America, we make up some 90% of the Jewish people. But we tell a story of what we call michurban lebinyan, from destruction to rebirth. That's the narrative that animates all the work that we do in the Jewish world. Everything that we think, everything that we say, everything that we feel is built on a background of the Jewish people suffered its worst catastrophe, at least in 2,000 years and maybe ever, in the middle of the 20th century, but in an almost miraculously rapid way, 3.5 years after Auschwitz stopped doing what it did, the Jews had a country. And although that country came perilously close in all kinds of ways, economic, military, international, diplomatic, etc., to the precipice, it always somehow figured out a way to go forward. And that has really enabled us. It doesn't matter what denomination we are, it doesn't matter what country we live in, whether it's any of the diaspora countries or Israel. It's enabled all of us as Jews to tell a story of from destruction to rebirth because of what Israel is. And I therefore say the following very advisedly, and although it'll sound hyperbolic, I don't mean it to be hyperbolic at all. Israel is at an existential crisis, and that means that its existence is at stake. And I want to make clear that what's at stake in Israel's existence is not just Israel's existence, but what's at stake in Israel's existence is the Jewish experience of all of us, no matter where we live, because we all tell that story of Churban Lebinyan. We all tell that story of destruction to rebirth. If God forbid, I don't think it's going to happen, by the way, but I do think it's a possibility, and I'll explain what I think we need to do to make sure we avert it. But if God forbid Israel were to somehow not make it through this crisis, or this were to be the beginning of a long decline, that 50 years from now, people will say the winter, spring of 2023 was when it all started. It will affect not only Israel and Israeli Jews, it'll dramatically affect American Jews. Also, the American Jewish community would look nothing like what it looks like if things were, God forbid, to go south in Israel in a way that none of us want to contemplate, but we actually all are contemplating, which is what brings us here together tonight. So what I'd like to do very briefly is to explain how the government and Israel got into the crisis that they're currently in, what were the supposed issues, what were the real issues, and what were the even more real issues that the judicial reform has now unleashed, so that even if Yariv Levin, who's the Minister of Justice, were to say tomorrow, okay, forget it, I take it all back, we're dropping the whole thing, something's been unleashed in Israel, it's not going away, and it's going to have to get dealt with by extraordinarily capable and open-minded leadership, and we'll come to that in a second. We had elections on November 1st in Israel. It was our fifth in a series of elections. We had them all because all of the results were so close and no government was really that stable. We had elections on November 1st, and this time Bibi Netanyahu did much better than he'd done in previous elections, and he was able to cobble together a coalition of 64 to 56. Now that might not sound like a tremendous number, but 64 is actually a fairly comfortable margin by Israeli standards, believe it or not. And he was able to do that by being very smart and doing something that the left did not do. In other words, the left, the Labor Party, which, just to give you a sense, the Labor Party is the founding party of the state of Israel. It's Ben-Gurion's party, it's Golda Meir's party, it's Yitzhak Rabin's party, it's Levi Eshkol's party. I mean, it's the founding party of Israel. Got 44 seats in the 1949 elections, which were the first elections that Israel had, and it got 4 in this past election. Labor Party is on its way out. It's heading towards oblivion, and that's just a sort of a symptom of the way in which the country is changing from the way in which the country looked, what it looked like when it was founded in 1948. But Labor knew it was in trouble, and it knew that Meretz was in even greater trouble. Meretz was the most far left Jewish party that runs for the Knesset typically, and you need to get to 3.25% of the electorate, or you don't make it into the Knesset, and your votes are all lost. So Lapid, who was the prime minister right before the elections, spent basically the entire campaign pleading with Merav Michaeli, who was the chair of the Labor Party, to run with Meretz combined. That way, they were clearly going to make it into the Knesset. So that way, no Meretz votes would be lost. And three things happened. Number one, Michaeli said absolutely not. Lapid was unable to convince her. Number two, Lapid therefore spent the entire campaign trying to convince Merav Michaeli and not trying to convince the Israeli people. So he actually didn't campaign in this particular campaign. He campaigned with one person and she didn't listen to him. And Meretz did not make it in. So those many, many hundreds of thousands of votes were just simply lost. And the left lost all those votes. Bibi is very smart. He was unwilling to let that happen. And he understood that the smaller factions in his world were the factions to the far right. And even though he either did or did not find those factions personally distasteful, he decided to run with them. That includes Bezalel Smotrich of Jewish Power. It includes Itamar Ben-Gvir. It included Avi Maoz of the Noam Party, a kind of a virulently anti-LGBTQ party. Bibi's not anti-LGBT, by the way. That one thing is very clear. But he didn't really care who he brought into the farm. He just wanted all the animals in one corral so that they would not lose any of those votes. And that's what happened, basically. If you look at the popular vote, so to speak, I mean, we don't have an electoral college, but if you look at the popular vote and you count the Meretz votes, the country was basically split 50-50. The reason Bibi has a majority and the left doesn't is because the left did not run together and the right did, and the left lost all of those votes. So the first major crisis of this government, which now seems quaint, relatively speaking, was the Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, Maoz triumvirate that was brought in. If you recall, Tom Friedman wrote an article in the New York Times saying the Israel that we knew was gone. I wrote a little column saying the Israel we knew was not gone. Other than that, we completely agreed. And again, these are very, to my mind, very unappealing characters. I mean, Ben-Gvir, who's now looking to have his own militia in Israel, for example, is a guy that the army refused to draft because he thought he was so uncontrollable and untrustworthy. They didn't even want him as a soldier. So, and now he's going to have his own militia. I don't think he's going to get that militia, but that's what he's asking for and so forth. But that was the first storm. And back then it felt like a very big storm, and now it seems rather minor. The next major storm was the storm that's still going on to a certain extent, which is the storm of judicial reform. And what I want to explain very quickly, because it's very, very complicated, but I think we need to say more than they wanted to change the power of the Supreme Court. Everybody pretty much knows that. But do something between just saying that and going into all of the nitty-gritty. So I'm going to take like 3 or 4 minutes and try to explain what's at the core of the judicial reform. And then in Talmudic fashion, what I want to do is try to make the best case for each side. In other words, I have a very clear opinion. My opinion is not hidden. I'm very much opposed to the judicial reforms as they are currently proposed, which I don't think are going to pass anyway. But I do think it's important not to say why I'm opposed to them, but what's the best argument for judicial reform? Try to understand those people who are in favor of it. It can't be that almost half the country is either wicked or stupid. I mean, that's just not possible. So we have to ask ourselves what's going on here. So let's just start out with the basics. The proposed judicial reform comes in 2 packages, one by Yariv Levin, who's the Minister of Justice, one by Simcha Rothman, who's the chair of the Knesset Committee on Constitution, Law, and Justice. It doesn't really matter. They are 2 very similar versions of almost the same thing. You just need to know that there are disagreements between them about certain technicalities. The idea was to severely clip the wings of the Israeli Supreme Court in 4 basic ways. And again, I'm oversimplifying, but giving more than just saying clip the wings of the Supreme Court. They were going to do it in 4 basic ways. Number one, they were going to change the constitution or the nature of the committee that picks judges at all 3 levels: the local level, the district level, and the Supreme Court level. Israel has those 3 levels. The same committee that picks all of the judges. It's right now controlled fundamentally by the current judges and the Bar Association. And many people feel that that is highly anti-democratic. Now, I will remind you that Supreme Courts are almost by definition anti-democratic. Like a plurality of Americans want abortion to be legal, but the Supreme Court has ruled more or less that states have a right to make it illegal if they want to make it illegal. So Supreme Courts have never been fully democratic, and part of what they're meant to do is to stop a runaway democratic government that would do something populist and not fair to minorities or whatever. So they're not wrong that it's undemocratic, but it's too undemocratic. And one of the 4 fundamental planks of this judicial reform is to reconstitute the nature of that committee, and the question is, how much do you reconstitute it? Levin's proposal basically gave all the power to the Knesset to appoint judges, not actually, but for all intents and purposes, gave all the power to the Knesset. And what that means, therefore, is the Knesset would pass the laws and would be the people that chose the judges that would theoretically review the laws in the first place. But to make matters even worse, the second plank of this reform was that the judges wouldn't really review the laws. It basically did away with what we call in America judicial review. Not entirely, there would be exceptions, but there would be many, many, many cases in which the court would have no right to review legislation. And therefore, so for example, just to give you an example, according to the proposal that Rothman made, a simple majority, not necessarily 61 to 59, 32 to 30 if everybody's got the flu. I mean, whatever number you want, a simple majority, whoever shows up at the Knesset that day, could pass a law saying that all mosques, Reform and conservative synagogues are hereby closed. We don't want them. Now, according to the Rothman and Levin proposals, there's no Supreme Court. If they call that a basic law, there's no Supreme Court that can then review that. Now, they would say, well, that's an exaggeration because the next Knesset would have to reaffirm this law or it would drop off the books. And if people didn't like the law, well, then they wouldn't vote for that party in the Knesset. But there's two problems with that. The first problem is that for the next 4 years, there would be no mosques, Reform synagogues, or conservative synagogues. I mean, so even if it was only for 4 years, that's a huge violation of people's religious freedom. Number two, however strongly people felt about this issue, they're never going to feel as strongly about it as they do about economics, security, and so on and so forth. So they're not going to vote on they're not going to make their party choice based on this issue anyway. They might care about Reform synagogues, conservative synagogues, or mosques, but they won't care about it as much as they care about Iran, the Palestinians, Gaza, the economy, and so on and so forth. So basically, no subsequent Knesset is going to get elected or not elected on the basis of this law, which means the Knesset can do anything that it wanted. And that's what has led to the uproar in Israel, that if you change who picks the judges and you basically emasculate the Supreme Court so that it can't push back on anything the Knesset does, you are opening the floodgates to a highly populist regime, which is why what people say is that it's not judicial reform, it's regime change. And one of the things that's very interesting to see in Israel is on our WhatsApp groups and all of the social media in Israel, we're constantly getting little video messages from civil leaders in Hungary and in Poland, speaking mostly in English and occasionally in Hungarian and Polish with translation, into Hebrew. And they're saying, we're just telling you, this is how it went down in Hungary and Poland. In other words, first they emasculated the Supreme Court, then they changed how the judges were picked, and then they passed all these laws. And now we are democracies only in name. So we're just telling you, protesters who are out there by the hundreds of thousands, don't give up because they think they can wear you down, and they might be able to wear you down, and they are not going to give up. So it's very sobering. That's a part of the Israeli European discourse that's not making it any way into the English press, as far as I can tell, at least. The third plank is something called the reasonability clause. We won't go into it, but courts were allowed to make rulings based on a kind of a reasonableness test, which they have done in a few cases, including not let Aryeh Deri be a minister of the Treasury when he's a felon. And they wanted to take that away, and they wanted to change the legal status of the legal advisors to the various ministries who are now picked by the Attorney General, and their advice is the minister is compelled to follow their advice. They want to make the minister able to appoint her or his own attorney and to make it in an advisory capacity only. Those seem like less major. They actually have potentially far-reaching ramifications, but basically what happened is when this all was sprung, and the Likud, of course, says, we didn't spring it on you. We've been talking about it for decades. That's not untrue, but it's not actually true. Meaning everybody who follows politics closely has known that this has been a major plank of people like Yariv Levin and Simcha Rothman and so on and so forth. But no, Bibi did not mention it basically once in the entire campaign season. He'd let everyone think it wasn't a top priority. And then as soon as the ink was dry on the coalition agreements, this thing then sprung through. And much to the surprise of the government, the reaction of a huge swath of Israeli population, not the left, but the left and the center and some of the Likud. In other words, when I go to these protests on Saturday nights in Jerusalem, There's always one or two people there carrying a Likud flag. And it's not an in-your-face Likud flag like, well, you think you're having an anti-judicial reform protest and I'm here to wave my flag at you. That's not what it means at all. They're saying, I'm with you. I'm a Likud voter, but I'm with you. I'm opposed to this. And as I may have mentioned before, the polls are now showing that if elections were held today, Bibi would drop from 34 seats to 20. So he knows he's hemorrhaging badly. And part of what he's probably doing is looking for a way down the tree without having to acknowledge that he's given up. But nonetheless, the reaction to this has been vociferous because people see it, as I said before, not as judicial reform, but fundamentally as regime change, which would turn Israel from a liberal democracy either into an illiberal democracy or a non-democracy. And you see what happens to the Moody's ratings just in the last 24, 48 hours. You see what's happened to Bloomberg. You see what's happening to all sorts of prognostications about Israel that have nothing to do with the judicial system, has everything to do with how stable the international community thinks Israel would be as a community. Now, there's many subparts here, which we won't go into, the economics of all of this, the split in the military and pilots refusing to train and to fly, and the real moral complexity of that, a very, very morally complex decision to say, I'm not going to fly on this mission. I mean, after all, pilots never said I wouldn't fly for Begin or I wouldn't fly for Rabin. I mean, they've never done that before. So this is a very, very dangerous Rubicon to cross. But on the other hand, it's a different kind of Rubicon. What I want to do for a second, though, is say, well, what's the argument for this judicial reform? I mean, are these people all just basically fundamentally fascists and they want to turn Israel into something else? And I want to say something about the nature of the judiciary in Israel, number one, and the personal biographical histories of virtually everybody who's involved in this process, meaning Rothman, Levin, many others, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, not Maoz so much, but many of the players here have one biographical detail in common, and it's very important, and I'll come back to it in a second. The argument that they make is not entirely wrong. This Israeli Supreme Court under Aharon Barak, who was the Chief Justice in the 90s, was a very activist Supreme Court that said openly, I mean, you can find Barak wrote lots of law review articles on this in American law reviews. You can see this everywhere. He also wrote a book that was reviewed by Robert Bork. So after this, you can make yourself a note. You can just Google Azure, A-Z-U-R-E, which is a journal that Shalem used to put out, and Bork, B-O-R-K, and Barak, B-A-R-A-K, and you'll see Bork's review of Aharon Barak, and you'll see the classic conservative, strict constructionist response to a very activist court position. And Barak took all sorts of liberties for the court, and he read into the existing law freedom of religion. He read into existing law equality, which had not been passed by the Knesset, and so on and so forth. And I think most people who are in the center would argue that there is definitely room for some reining in of the Supreme Court. That's not wrong. That's actually overdue. There is room for some change in the nature of the composition of the committee that picks the judges. That's not wrong. That's actually overdue. But to go as far as they're going is actually regime change, not a tweaking of something that needs to be managed a bit better. And again, we could go into all of it, but I just want to make it clear. The idea of judicial reform is not an evil idea. The idea of reining in the Supreme Court a bit is not an evil idea. The idea of choosing judges differently than we do now is not an evil idea. The question is the fix worse than the problem? And here, many, many people in Israel, including many on the right, that's the only way Bibi could go from 34 to 20. That can only happen by people who voted for him last time, saying they're not going to vote for him this time. And so there's many people on the right who thinks this goes too far. I want to mention just one thing. My views are clear. I'm opposed to the judicial reform packages as they are now. I'm opposed to anything remotely close to what they are now. But again, I want to try to understand the people who disagree with me. Important to understand that Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, Rothman, Levin, and many others all came of age around 2005. Those are their earliest political years. In other words, 2005 is the disengagement. And what they say in various op-eds in Israeli newspapers, and even somebody like Yoel Ben-Nun, who is a very moderate voice and a very lovely man and a Talmid Chacham, and a person that I personally like very much, wrote a piece about this in Makor Rishon about 3 weeks ago. They say, look, 8,000 Israelis were moved out of Gaza in 2005, 8,000. Cities were bulldozed. Children and parents were disinterred and reburied on the other side of the border. Synagogues were destroyed. Families were pulled apart. The divorce rate skyrocketed. The suicide rate skyrocketed. The failure of businesses skyrocketed, much of which had been predicted even before the disengagement. And they said, and the Supreme Court decided not to get involved. People petitioned the Supreme Court, the right petitioned the Supreme Court to block the disengagement. And the Supreme Court said, no, the Knesset has spoken. And they say, 3 houses in Sheikh Jarrah, which are owned by Palestinians, occupy the Supreme Court year in and year out. And they say, how is it possible that 3 Palestinian families take up so much of the Supreme Court oxygen and 8,000 Israeli Jews didn't even get a hearing at the Supreme Court? That's on an emotional level what animates them, a sense that the court is fundamentally in bed with the left and the center, fundamentally hostile to the right, fundamentally hostile to the settlement project, which is not true. It's actually been pretty supportive of the settlement project, except when settlements are built on private Palestinian land. Other than that, it's given settlers and the army wide-ranging rights to do a whole bunch of things. But I just want you to understand that these people are animated by what for them was a profound trauma in Israeli history. And even if people like, I actually favored the disengagement. I would now refer to the disengagement as a catastrophic mistake that Israel needed to make. In other words, we needed to see how bad it was to know how bad it was. If we had known how it was going to end, it would obviously, we should not have done it, but we didn't know. But obviously, many fewer Israelis and thousands fewer Palestinians would have been killed if Israel had never gotten out of Gaza. Because if Israel had not gotten out of Gaza, Hamas would not have taken over. All those wars would have not happened. All the bombing would not have not happened. All those Palestinian civilians would still be alive. But nonetheless, this for them was a major trauma. And that's on a certain level what the protests are about. The protests are about trying to force the Israeli government to back away from the judicial reform. Say one thing about protests. There's lots of different kinds of protests, and there's been a ton of research about what kind of protests work and which ones don't. Protests that stay completely within the line of the law have no impact, period. When Martin Luther King crossed the bridge, it was illegal. And he needed to make it clear that he was willing to violate the law in order to make it clear that he and his partners were not going to give up on the dream of equal rights for African Americans in the United States. Protests that look like Portland and Seattle accomplish the opposite of what they want to accomplish. People become enraged and so on and so forth. What's happened in Israel is not in any way Portland and Seattle. Exactly 0 cases of looting, 0. After now what is a total of millions of people in the street if you add them up week after week, 0. There have been 2 cases of police using too much force. One was 1 stun grenade and one was 1 guy on a horse who was hitting a woman with a stick. Neither of those are okay, but it's hardly what we saw in America. In other words, the leaders of these protests are navigating a very, very fine line. They are blocking the highways. And if you're on the highway, that's somewhere between annoying and infuriating. Because if you're in labor and you're stuck behind all these cars on the highway, it's actually terrifying. So it's not a small thing to block the highways, but they're trying to navigate how do we do civil disobedience, which does cross the line from legal to illegal, without showing disdain for the country. And then the last point that I'll make at this point, I'm going to make one last point, and we'll open it up to the rabbis, is it's very important to understand that this is not about disdain for the country, and that the most brilliant thing that the left and center did here was to take the Israeli flag as its symbol. And you've seen now thousands and thousands and thousands of Israeli flags. Think about protests in America. The flag is the symbol of the right, which it should not be. I mean, the left should be just as much in love with America as the right is. But for a very long time in Israel also, if you saw a protest with flags, you knew it was a right-wing protest. And the left and the center decided this time, no, we're not. We're in love with this country. That's what this is about. This is an explosion of love, not hate. And it's an explosion of love, not resentment. And therefore, the flag's going to be our symbol. That was a brilliant, brilliant move. And that has enabled many people who would have been perhaps a little bit uncomfortable joining these protests, like those Likud voters, to enable to cross the lines and saying, yeah, we're with you because it's about this country. The last thing I'll say is this, like everything in the world, Obama wasn't just about Obama. and Trump wasn't just about Trump. They each unleashed long-standing tensions in American life. Depending on how you feel about each of them, you ascribe, responsibility differently, and we're certainly not going to go near that today. But this has unleashed really are two very different Israels. What the right would call a European, Ashkenazi, privileged, secular elite, who they thought didn't really care that much as long as people left them alone so they could code and go public and have exits. And they were proven to be very wrong. These people care a lot. And a more religious, less privileged, Mizrahi, more culturally conservative, much more embracing of religion as an instinct group, which for a very long time in Israel was a minority of Israeli Jews, but is now a majority of Israeli Jews. The three faces that you now see on the screen, Rabbi Wiederhorn, Rabbi Friedman, and myself, what we look like is a minority of Israeli Jews. That's just the reality of it. We are a minority now. And the majority is basically saying, now it's payback time. For 75 years, you ran this country. For 75 years, you treated us the way you treated us. For 75 years, you disparaged religion. For 75 years, you did this and you did that. And now we won the election fair and square. And you're sore losers because we won. And we told you what we were running on, and you lost the election, and now you're disrupting the streets. It's not an entirely fair argument, but it's certainly not an entirely unfair argument, which is my point that there is a lot of justice here on all sides. This is not good versus evil. This is not pro-Israel as opposed to anti-Israel. This is a lot of things. At the end of the day, my own view is that the judicial reform as it's been proposed would fundamentally undermine Israel's democracy, which would then fundamentally undermine Israel's economy and the desire of many people, including my children and perhaps Rabbi Wiederhorn's daughter, I can't speak for her, I don't know, desire to stay, which in the end would actually undermine Israel's ability to survive. So it is actually an existential moment, but that doesn't mean that one side is all right or one side is all wrong. And what I would simply say is that we have to try to do is understand the best intentions of both sides, and to remember next week when we get to Yom HaAtzmaut, that even though we are really in a moment of great crisis, and I will be personally very surprised if we get through this without some violence of some sort. I will be very happy if we get through it without violence, but I will also be very surprised. Having said that, we have to hope and pray that whatever the very turbulent short term looks like, we get through it in the medium run and in the long run. And specifically on Yom HaAtzmaut, we have to remember that with all of the pain and with all of the worry and with all of the crisis, what Israel looks like today bears no resemblance to what anybody in 1948 could have imagined in their wildest dreams. It is more secure, it is more democratic, it is more accepted in the international community. It is more almost everything than you can possibly imagine, they could have imagined in 1948. And we therefore have, I think, a kind of a complicated emotional week coming up. We have to be very committed to whatever we're committed to on this particular issue. And at the same time, even as we're deeply worried, figure out some way of celebrating the extraordinary miracle that the Jewish state is, a miracle that is critical not only to the future of the Jews who live in Israel, but the Jews who live in the United States and everywhere else on the planet as well. So I'll stop with that.
All right. Danny, thank you so much for that, for framing the issue and the situation so cogently and with depth for us. Want to offer a few questions that our participants have put in the chat to myself and to Rabbi Wiederhorn. Want to start with the current moment we're in, which has been a pause, a pre-Pesach pause. All of Israel goes on a pause for Pesach, basically, and this was a pre-Pesach pause, caused in part or engendered in part because from the beginning of the protests, it was clear that the tech sector and the drivers of Israel's economy were against these judicial reforms, but that didn't have a huge impact until the military leadership and the pilots, as you mentioned, and reservists, and then eventually the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, came out in opposition to the reforms. And part of the reason for the pause is that seemed to put Israel on a shaky defense footing or a less secure defense footing. So I use that as a frame for the question that one congregant asked. which reminds me of your Horban metaphor.
Korban Lebinyan, yeah.
Horban Lebinyan. So is the infighting among Jewish groups and parties a greater threat to Israel than its foreign enemies?
Without question. Not even close. I mean, the only enemy that Israel has that can do it any serious damage is Iran. And there's lots and lots of talk these days about Israel taking the first step with Iran within the next year. There's been a lot of talk about that, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that Israel does not want to, Bibi knows this as better as well as anybody else. Israel cannot afford to alienate the Biden administration at exactly the point when it might need spare parts for all those planes. They're all American made. The United States actually gives Israel a tremendous amount of military aid, but it's doled out. And Israel cannot afford to alienate the members. So Iran is a huge issue. But Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinians, all those other various groups, they're very, very dangerous in the sense that they can destroy families. If you look at the D family from DEE family from, a week and a half ago, how this man gets up in the morning with 2 of his 5 children dead and his wife dead. I mean, the lives are ruined. I mean, these people, their lives are ruined. One can hope and pray that he'll find happiness and love down the road and that his children will grow up okay. But these are ruined lives. That's what terrorism does. Terrorism ruins lives. Terrorism cannot bring down a country. Even the Intifada between 2000 and 2004, which took the lives of thousands of Israelis, was never going to bring down Israel. You have to put boots on the ground to bring down a country, or have non-conventional weapons that can just destroy it from afar. I don't know what Iran really intends, but I also really do believe that Israel's not going to let Iran do whatever Iran intends. And I don't have any inside information, thank God, because if I had it, it would be everywhere. But I assume that there's very smart people who are working on that and who've been thinking about it for a very long time. That's my assumption. I hope I'm not wrong. This could split the country right down the middle. This could emasculate the economy. This could make people leave. This could make Israel a pariah in the international community. 75 years of war and 50 years of conflict, 50-something years of conflict with the Palestinians, has never been able to do that. I mean, even when the UN voted in 75 that Zionism was racism, I remember that very vividly. I was in a young Judea youth group at that point, the Zionist youth group, and they gave out little things for our wallets that had a list of the countries that had voted with us. It was a pretty small list. But nonetheless, even that very lonely diplomatic moment for Israel, which was infuriating on some of those, there was no way it was going to bring down Israel. This is an entirely different issue. So this is a much more dangerous moment.
Thank you.
Jenny, we've known each other a long time, nearly 30 years now. And I was actually having flashbacks to Talmud.
Since you were 4, I think.
Yeah, I was having flashbacks to Talmud class when you were talking about, you have to understand both sides of the argument and whatnot. But I was surprised, to see the letter that you based on all that I know about you and all that I've read that you've written before, for you to co-write a letter with Mati Friedman and Yossi Klein Halevi to basically say, okay, American Jewish community, we need your voice now to help preserve Israel as both a Jewish and democratic state. In the past, we've heard you say things like, this is an internal Israel issue. You guys are in America. Don't cross that line. This is us. We have to deal with this because we're sending our children to the army, right? Why was this time different? Why did you sign the letter? And has it been successful?
Okay, those are all very good questions. As my wife reassures me at the end of the long days, if half your hate mail is coming from the left and half your hate mail is coming from the right, you're probably okay. So the hate mail has been coming pretty much half from the left and half from the right. So I guess we're okay. Yossi and Mati and I all had, I think, different reasons for writing the letter. We all wanted the letter to read a little bit differently. I actually wanted it to have a different title than it had, and it mattered to me a lot, but they didn't agree, and I went along. In other words, so I'm going to speak for myself now. That's my way of saying that I'm going to speak for myself. I'm not speaking for Yossi, and I'm not speaking for Mati. The reason we wrote it together was because we thought the three of us are pretty solidly perceived as non-leftists. I don't think anybody sees us as far right, but I don't think we could be mistaken accidentally for people on the left, particularly when it comes to American Jewish involvement in Israel's internal issues. And it was important for us to make it very clear that we were speaking from that space on the spectrum and not to get a lot of other voices, which would have then perhaps muddied that clarity. Even though there's a lot of great people out there who we could have asked to join us, we wanted that clarity. I think on that spectrum, we're almost completely aligned. And I think our books all take almost exactly the same position. I'm going to speak for myself. When you're negotiating with whatever it is, whether it's in a marital negotiation or with another foreign country or with a board of your business or whatever it is, you have to, as the negotiating trainers always say, imagine the other person's victory speech. If they can't give a victory speech, they're not going to make the deal. I want Bibi to be able to make a victory speech, even if the version of that victory speech is, I just had no choice. I had to back down because I promised to do this and I wanted to do this. I just couldn't. I don't care what it takes to enable him to back down. I want him to be able to back down. He's the proverbial cat that climbed up the tree, did not realize how high the branch is, and now we need the fire engine to come with the ladder and help get the cat down. The idea of the letter was to offer, it was a very, very narrowly focused letter. It was read by, well, I mean, it got several 100,000 hits just on Times of Israel alone. So I mean, it was read by many hundreds of thousands of people, but it was really directed at a few dozen people. It was directed at the lay leadership of a few critical American Jewish organizations to enable them to say to their professional leadership, look, Friedman and Halevi and Gordis, who are hardly leftists, are all saying we should get involved this time. And we think we should get involved because every ladder that we put up against the tree gives Bibi one more option. And if Bibi could say, you know, we've got the economists, and we've got the pilots, and we've got Moody's, and we've got Bloomberg, and we've got the Biden administration, and we've got this, and we have the federations and ADL and APAC, and, you know, name all of your alphabet soup. My thought was, okay, it's one more ladder. And as a guy in his 60s, I think Maki may still serve reserve duty. I don't remember anymore. Yossi and I definitely don't. So, I mean, what could we do? We all wanted to do something to help our country. We all felt it's important to go out and protest, and we all do protest all the time. But we wanted to do something more. That was for Daniel Gordis. That was the agenda of the letter. Did it work? It worked with some organizations that did come out very firmly. And I know from people who were in the meetings that the letter was cited explicitly many times. And in other organizations, it didn't work. Do I have any regrets? No, I don't have any regrets. Did I know full well up front that it would be either purposely or unintentionally misunderstood by some people? I knew that. It felt like the call of the hour, and it felt like this was not the moment to take the safe route, career-wise or personally. It felt like the moment to do the right thing.
And would you distinguish between, thank you, would you distinguish between encouraging the North American Jewish community to get involved, speak up, have a voice, versus the United States government getting involved?
It's a very good question. Look, I think all of these things, I want to make it clear, refer to this specific issue. I mean, if God willing, we get beyond this, and then there's another Gaza war and Israel starts pounding Gaza, that's what I'm going to write again to you guys. Let us handle the war. We're getting attacked, you're not getting attacked, and you'll say, well, that's inconsistent. And you're right, it's inconsistent because it's a different existential challenge for us right now. I know a lot of people who are furious at the United States government for coming down so hard, but I see it as another ladder. In other words, I really see it, I don't know if it's animated by a love of Israel or a hatred of Israel, or a love of Bibi or a hatred of Bibi, but I actually personally don't really care. And whatever I think of Biden is what I think of Biden, which just doesn't make any difference for this conversation at all. If American pressure, this is going to, if this judicial reform goes through, I fear Israel's over, period. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next year, but within 20 years, yeah, it's not a first world country anymore. It's not the country that your congregations are going to want to get together and celebrate. It's going to be the kind of country people go like that. And they're just, it's over. And so I think we need to do whatever we can do to save this miraculous, critically important part of the Jewish story for as long as we possibly can. So I am one of those people who, again, I don't normally like the United States intervening in our business. And I very often don't like the policies of, you know, this party or that party, depending on who the president is. But in this particular case, if the Biden administration whispers to Bibi, there's no spare parts and you can't attack Iran, and then Bibi uses that to say to Levin, I'm sorry, buddy, but Iran's not going away either way, and I can't afford to take the risk, so I'm going to have to put you aside. And that's what I'm going to say to the voters. If that's what it takes to give Bibi that ladder down, and I just think that maybe Biden's policy on spare parts might matter a bit more than our letter. So yeah, I mean, I'm okay with it now, even though I recognize again that it's a very dangerous precedent, and you got to be very careful what you wish for, because it can come back and bite you in a different setting. We've all been alive long enough to know that invariably happens, but it's a risk that I felt we need to take at this point. So I am not distinguishing right now. There are very different kinds of pressure, but I personally am in favor of both of them at this moment.
Danny, Yogi Berra famously said you should avoid making predictions, especially about the future. That said, one of the things that we look to you to do is to have a bit of a crystal ball and to help us see how things might play out. So can you give us a sense of where you see things headed? Will a modified judicial reform, is that likely to pass, and what might that modified reform be? Would the coalition survive such a step? Would Bibi survive not just politically but legally such a step? So those are
right.
I'm combining a bunch of questions from the audience.
Yeah, no, they're all very good questions, and they really do fit together. So I mean, there's a variety of scenarios. So there's a variety of variables. So one question, as you mentioned, Michael, is the question of, is this government going to survive? The government is very rickety right now. Avi Maoz has already quit his ministerial position. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir say that they're going to quit their positions, but they're going to support the government from the outside. My own personal prediction is that Ben-Gvir is not going to get the militia that he wants. If he gets any militia at all, it's going to be a very watered down version. It's going to make him infuriated. So he may quit the coalition. Some Likud members who are worried about the future of the party. It's very analogous to what's happening here in the Republican Party, by the way, saying that the leader is now dragging us down. So there are many people who are saying, you got to stop this, Bibi, because you're killing the whole party. So I don't think the smart money is this government being in power in a year. That doesn't mean that I'm sure it won't be. But if you force me with a gun to my head to bet whether or not the government's going to be in power in a year, I would say it's probably not. Does that mean that we're going to have elections? Again, anybody's guess. But Bibi has a vested interest in not going to elections, because if he goes to elections, he's likely to lose. If he loses, he's not in power. If he's not in power, he could theoretically be convicted and imprisoned. My own views, by the way, about the prosecution of Bibi would probably surprise you. But I think the charges should be dropped, and he should be given another ladder down. I don't have any vested interest in his going to jail. Whatever he did. Whatever he didn't do. The prosecution has been astonishingly incompetent. And so whether he did it or not, and I have no idea, my own view is that there's no national value here in pursuing this, but obviously a lot of people disagree with me. So another possibility, of course, is that Bibi would pair up with Gantz and Lapid, and we would have something like what's called a national unity government. We had our first national unity government in 1967, before the Six-Day War, where Menachem Begin came in from the political desert and the opposition for the first time in his career. As many people who are listening know, he and Ben-Gurion were basically each other's nemesis. And the first thing that Begin said in his first cabinet meeting is, let's tell Ben-Gurion we need him to come back and be prime minister now. In other words, moments of crisis do bring out a certain amount of largesse. And in fact, people did approach Ben-Gurion, and he just said, no, I mean, I'm too old. I'm not doing this. There's a war coming up. You need somebody different than me. We also needed somebody different than Eshkol, but that's a different story altogether. Not so much because of how the war went, but because of decisions that were made post the war. Eshkol was not in a position to make tough choices and all of that. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some sort of a form of either a unity government or a new coalition where Bibi teams up with Gantz and maybe even Lapid, Gantz being more likely. Gantz is polling as the #1 person right now. Now Gantz, because he's polling as the #1 party, obviously has a vested interest in calling for elections and running. But he might actually just show that he's a real statesman by not doing that, and by saying, I probably would win, but I don't need to win. I just need this government to stop what it's doing and to be stable. We'll focus on Iran. We'll try to rebuild the economy a little bit, and we'll figure out what's going on. That, I think, is sort of the best scenario. In that case, either no judicial reform gets passed, or more likely, keeping in mind the other person's victory speech, some modified form of judicial reform gets passed, some tweaking of the nature of that committee of judges, some tweaking perhaps of the ability of the Supreme Court to get involved in certain kinds of things. For example, that could be, you need a certain number of Supreme Court justices to agree before you can do judicial review. 12 out of 15, 13 out of 15, whatever the case may be. And then how many votes would it take for the Knesset to override it? Maybe if you said, the judicial review is X, and to override it, the Knesset would need not 61, but 85 or something like that, which is a very hard threshold to get to. I'm not even sure Israel's ever really had that threshold. But those are the kinds of tweaks that one could make where everybody can sort of declare victory. The hundreds of thousands of people, which includes me and my children in the streets, can say we won because we got the judicial reform that was going to turn Israel into an illiberal democracy not to get passed. Levin and Rothman can say we didn't get as much as we wanted, but we got judicial reform started and we're going to come back and do more. They can say that all they want. It enables Bibi to say, I'm prime minister, I remain prime minister, I brought in other people. It's a much more wider based coalition now than it was. Something like that is, I think, the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that nobody compromises and that they ram the judicial reform through. There's violence in the streets. The economy does tank. Israel does become an illiberal democracy. That's a lot of bad things happening, and it sounds like sort of a doomsday scenario, but it's really not unthinkable. I mean, I don't know what the percentage likelihood of it is, but it's not 10. It's not 50, but it's not 10, and it's not 15. I don't know if it's 20, 25. It's not unthinkable. And here's where great statesmanship really comes to play. And I'll just point out that moments like this in a country's history can bring out leadership that we didn't know before. I think 4 months ago, no American Jew knew who Yoav Gallant was. And he is now the most trusted minister in the Israeli government. What did he do? He got fired and unfired. But seriously, right? Being fired by Bibi at that moment and having the courage to be in the Likud and to be from the military establishment and to look the Jewish people in the eye and say, this is really dangerous. People now say, okay, here's somebody with a spine, and here's somebody who's willing to call it like it is, even if he was going to lose his career, which for a certain number of days, it looked like he really might do. But that, of course, led to these spontaneous protests, which my son, who's 33 in Israel, he was a commando for 8 years. He clerked at the Supreme Court. He obviously went to law school. He's married, a kid on the way. I mean, he's had a great life. He told me and my wife, he texted us from those protests at 3 o'clock in the morning. He said, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. I've been out all night. I'm going home to shower, sleep a couple hours and go to work. By far, the most emotionally laden moment of my entire life. That's what he wrote. There's a tremendous amount of passion out there. The passion can be used for good. So nobody knew who Gallant was. Most of the people listening right now probably have no idea what's her first name? Something Bessemer. I'm just blanking on her first name. She's a physicist at the Weizmann Institute who's taken the lead in these protests. She's 6'3". She used to be a basketball player. I mean, so she's very noticeable as these little short cops arrest her. There's 2 little guys, one gigantic woman. She's proven to be an unbelievably fascinating, powerful, interesting personality. Maybe her first career was she played in Israel's national basketball team. Her second career was that she's been a physicist at Weizmann. Maybe her third career is in politics and statesmanship. We don't really know. But sometimes these kinds of moments really do bring out Shikma Bessemer is her name. Sometimes these moments really bring out untried leadership. So you can see a world in which a Yoav Gallant, a Shikma Bessemer, and other people that we've never heard of begin to come to the fore and perhaps engender a conversation. The very, very best case scenario would be that there's some compromise. I don't think we should win everything. I think we should allow people on the other side to feel like they got some progress made. I think that's important. They're not wrong that the Supreme Court needs to be reined in. So I don't think that an absolute collapse of the judicial reform would be the best scenario. But the very, very best scenario within that would be that what happens in Israel now is a serious national conversation that leads to a constitution. Not in 6 months and not in a year, but in 5 years. There's a lot of reasons that Israel promised in the Declaration of Independence to pass the Constitution by October 1st, 48. It was clearly never going to happen. It was a stipulation of the UN partition vote that they threw it in, said, yeah, we'll do it because the UN said we had to do it. Ben-Gurion never wanted it. Begin never wanted it. They each had very good reasons for not wanting it. I think we're seeing now is we need, if not the Constitution itself, at least the conversation that would produce such a document. And that's a conversation that Israel really needs to get. And I hope and pray that what we'll look back on is and say, at 75 years, we both celebrated the miracle of 75 years of independence, and at the same time, did the really difficult, important work to make sure that 75 years from now, our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are still celebrating Israel as a sovereign liberal democracy.
Well, you just answered my last question regarding the Constitution, whether like now may be the time to do this.
It is.
Yeah.
It is the time to do it.
Yeah.
It's hard. And, obviously in any constitution, somebody's going to gain power, somebody's going to lose power. And so you might write a constitution that you say doesn't come into effect for 5 years or 7 years, because that way nobody knows who's going to be in office. Nobody knows who's going to have what powers, and nobody's giving up anything. And there's lots of ways of doing this. And there are many drafts of this constitution out there. Moshe Koppel, who's a rather, kind of in the crossfire figure right now because he's the head of the Kohelet Forum. He's written 2 drafts of a constitution. Yedidya Stern, who used to be the head of the Israel Democracy Institute, who I would call a centrist, not at all a leftist, he's very much in favor of some judicial reform, has written a draft. There have been drafts written all the way through, and I think there's probably about 15-ish full drafts out there. It's been done. We have to have the conversation. We haven't really had a chance in this whole discussion to talk about the genuine sense of marginalization that the Mizrahi majority feels. And speaking now as an American educated, middle class, white, not secular, I admit I don't fit the bill in that regard, Ashkenazi, privileged person, and I really am privileged in that way. I mean, I really, really am. I fully recognize that my part of Israel really needs to come to terms with how the other side of Israel sees things. I'll just give you one quick example to show everybody how complicated this is. So these pilots refuse to go and show up. They refuse to train. They refuse to fly. They're reservists. They're not in the Air Force. They're all reservists, but you have to fly X number of days a month to stay flight worthy if you're called up. When they finally went back to base, the mechanics, who are not white, who are not Ashkenazi, who are not secular, said to them, "Who the hell do you think you are?" Like, if we said we're not servicing the planes, you know where we'd be? We'd be in jail. So get off the base. We have no interest in seeing you. We have no interest in servicing your planes. We have no interest in loading armaments onto your planes. Get off the base. Now, some of them did, some of them didn't, but even the act of not going to fly reminded some Mizrahim that that's an act of privilege, that you can do that, and the worst thing that'll happen to you is they'll throw you out of the reserves. They're not going to jail you. You just don't jail pilots in Israel. But that was another reminder that there's a huge social divide, and these social divides are very real. They're much more complicated than we can get to in a piece like this. And this is not about self-promotion, but just as Jerry mentioned it, I really tried to give a lot of attention to the Mizrahi Ashkenazi divide in my history of Israel that came out about, 7 years ago or whatever it was, 2016, I think. But I really tried to give that a tremendous amount of attention because I felt then, and I still feel now, that it's one of the dimensions of Israel that is one of the simmering, ready to erupt issues in Israeli society that most people have no idea that the issue even exists, or if they do, they don't understand how deep it is. Just to give you just one quick statistic, in 1935, there's 17 million Jews in the world. We're not even close to that yet, having lost what we lost. But there were 17 million Jews in the world in 1935. 1 million of them were Mizrahim, 7%. Meaning, you could understand why the Chaim Nachman Bialik's and the David Ben-Gurions and the Golda Meirs and the Vladimir Jabotinskys and Ahad Ha'ams all felt those people were very marginal, because they were geographically marginal and they were demographically marginal. But now we're a century later, and they are the majority. And we still have a very Ashkenazi-centric notion of looking at, even Hatikva, Nefesh Ulfa'ate Mizrach Kadima Ayin L'Tzion Sofia. We gaze towards Zion out on the east. Not if you're from Iraq and Iran, it ain't to the east. And not if you're from Yemen, and not if you're from North Africa. In other words, even the Hatikva is a fundamentally Ashkenazi document, to say nothing of the fact that Israeli Arabs can't sing it, which is a whole different conversation for a different time, which is, I guess, a way of wrapping up my part here, which is to say that this is all very complicated. And this is not about the good guys versus the bad guys. This is not about the lovers of Israel versus the haters of Israel. This is not about pro-Israel versus anti-Israel. This is about a very, very, very complicated society in which a genie, which has been rattling around in the bottle for a very long time, got out of the bottle for a whole array of specific reasons. And what we who love Israel, whether we live in Israel or we live in America, We need to know it better. We just need to know the story much more deeply, much more detail than we possibly do at this point. We need to know how problematic even something like Hatikva is. We need to know about the demographic changes. We need to know about the Ashkenazi attitudes towards both religious Jews and Mizrahi Jews, to say nothing of religious Mizrahi Jews. And by the way, we won't go into it now, but we need to know how, ironically, the Mizrahi world has made it possible through Ehud Banai and the entire cultural scene, Yishai Ribo and many others. The Mizrahi world has become the doorway through which the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those hyper-secular Ashkenazi elites are making their way back to Jewish tradition. I mean, this is so complicated in so many ways. It demands learning, it demands love, and it demands prayer. And if we can keep those three things going, we can certainly celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, and I hope and pray many, many more Yemei HaAtzmaut for the years to come.
Wow. Really, Danny, I'm always amazed at how much you're able to say in such a short period of time. And Michael and I were trying to think about jumping in a few times, but every time
Sorry about that.
every time we wanted to say something, you went there before we did. So really amazing. Can I ask for one, maybe a final thought? I know you concluded and we're pretty much at our hour, but
That's fine, of course.
There's a series of questions that did come out that I just want to throw out, and maybe you can just say a word about. And you made slight reference at one point to this idea that, one day, if this all goes through, they could pass a law to close the mosques and the conservative and the reform synagogues and whatnot. There are a lot of people, obviously, that are concerned about something like that, and to what extent, the idea of conversion, of non-Orthodox conversions, plays a role in this. And do we even have a voice do we really have a voice as, the non-Orthodox world in America? And any advice you may have to, the couple hundred people here on the webinar along these lines with regard to, the liberal Judaism, non-Orthodox Judaism.
Look, it's very complicated. So just a couple of very quick bullet points. When you are in favor of civil rights, you don't say, for example, African Americans in America should have the rights that they have as long as they vote the way that I do. That's not civil rights. Civil rights is they should have the rights that they have because they're human beings and they're citizens of America, and they should use their vote to vote for whatever they believe in. The more the Mizrahi world gets power in Israel, the less the liberal Jewish world is going to have a secure footing in Israel, because they are socially very conservative. The women in those communities are doctors and lawyers and surgeons and pilots and all sorts of things. And they're very, very happy to sit on the women's side of the mechitza at shul. And it's not a matter, I'm not saying that disparagingly. They have a very traditional way of looking at life. They have certain standards for their children, how they want them to live and how they want them to behave. By the way, which is why the Mizrahi world and the Likud and Israeli Arab voters actually get along very well, because Israeli Arab voters are also socially very conservative. So ironically, they tend to vote, if they vote for a Jewish party, they're more often than not vote for the Likud than other parties. They vote all over the map to whatever extent they vote for non-Arab parties. So the first thing that I just want to make it clear is that we actually, as American liberal Jews, have conflicting interests here. In other words, we're completely in favor of civil rights in Israel, and both for Arabs and by the way, Arabs are also religiously very conservative. Arabs in Israel are opposed to civil marriage. Israel would probably have allowed civil marriage long before if it wasn't for the Muslims and the Christians. They're the ones who are fundamentally opposed to civil marriage, because that's the whole source of their leadership's power. And so we're going to be torn here between wanting Israeli Arabs and Jewish Mizrahim to be able to have a full flourishing of their rights and position in Israeli society, and what we want as liberal American Jews, because the liberal Jewish world that we want is simply foreign to them. It's completely foreign. They don't even know it well enough to dislike it. It's just foreign to them. It seems like a non-Israeli implant. They'll also look over and they'll say, yeah, very nice. Thank you very much. 70% intermarriage. We can do without that. Thank you very much. That's what they say. And that's a hard argument to counter to a certain extent. So there's that. But here's what I would say. I believe we can make a lot of progress on this. We can make a lot of progress, especially after moments of crisis like this. Very often people are willing to listen to each other better. I've read, sort of in Vogue and Esquire, that when a married couple has a fight, obviously something that I've never personally experienced, but if a married couple has a fight, after the brouhaha settles down, people actually listen a little bit better for a while. And it's very possible that after we get through this, we're going to listen better. But here comes the other side of that, and then I'll conclude with this. People tend to listen to those people who most of the time support them. And American Jews who are liberal American Jews cannot expect to lambast Israel every step of the way and then be heard about this. That's just never going to happen, ever, ever, ever. So the next time there's a Gaza war and we don't like the images of Israeli warplanes pounding Palestinian civilians, which I hate, obviously, any human being ought to hate that. Ask yourself the following question. Why is Meretz, Israel's most progressive Jewish party, voting with the Likud? Not saying a word about the conflict. What, they're not really progressives? They're not really liberals? They don't really care about Palestinians? Or is this something that gets beyond progressive liberal politics and is about survival, which is, of course, the answer? And if it's about survival and Israelis listen across the ocean and they say, there they go again, the Forward, the New York Times, the this, the that, and they're, we're just a bunch of occupying apartheid, power-hungry maniacs killing innocent Palestinians, they say, okay. And then the next time you knock on the door to talk about reform synagogues, they say, yeah, we get you. Thank you very much for stopping by. And that's not going to work. American Jews are going to have to show Israel that fundamentally their instinct are to support the Israeli people when they're fighting for their lives, even if the visuals of this thing look horrible on CNN or Fox or whatever. And then I'm hopeful that leadership on the American side and leadership with me and my colleagues on the Israeli side can try to bring people together. But there's some repairing of that relationship also that has to happen, because again, I'm not speaking for myself so much, but I'm speaking for my Israeli colleagues, my Israeli students, and my Israeli colleagues on my faculty who are not at all American and don't really get involved in this stuff. Their fundamental sense, without reading the fine print, is, oh, American Jews criticize everything we do, whatever. And then there's no conversation to be had. So there's a conversation between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. There's a conversation between the left and the right. There's a conversation between American Jews and Israeli Jews. There's lots of conversations. And the best way to start those conversations is A, what's the best argument for the position of the other person? And B, listening. And I hope that we can get there too.
Well, Danny, we want to thank you. You ended on such a perfect note. Just as a couple of words of conclusion, I was struggling a few months ago with the question of how we were going to engage our congregation and our community, our wider community, around Israel's 75th anniversary. Sure. It was a time where there was a sense of great despair, I will say. And that's not good when you're going into a milestone anniversary, such as we will celebrate next week. And then the protest movement started, and then it gained momentum, and then it showed real power. And the symbolism of the Israeli flag was, so, as you mentioned, was so powerful that what I see in our congregation and our wider community is that it aroused a certain passion and commitment that is always there within our hearts, but sometimes needs that little spark needs to be stoked a bit. Mm-hmm. So okay. I would say this is perfect timing to have that spark of our commitment and passion and care for the state of Israel and the Jews and everyone else who lives there to be stoked as we approach the 75th anniversary, and as we approach at Temple Israel and at TCS and in the wider Federation community, a whole series of events, both in person and online, everything from learning opportunities to worship services to guest speakers to celebrations that will enable us to continue to engage with passion and commitment and love for the state of Israel at this milestone anniversary. So I invite everyone who's participated this evening and all of your friends and all of your family to show up, to engage with us across the next several weeks, to listen to Danny's podcast and a number of other podcasts that are out there that are really insightful and influential in the Jewish world around Israel, not just around the proposed judicial reforms or the fight for democracy, but in general about the larger trends within Israel, to read Times of Israel and Jerusalem Post and all the other news sources that you can get that are Israeli news sources, but written also for an audience abroad. This is a wonderful time for both because of the anniversary and because of what's going on there, to continue to engage with passion. So thank you on behalf of all of us at Temple Israel and the Eisner family, which is in part supporting our Israel at 75 series of programming. I want to thank you, Danny, for being with us this evening and for your thought leadership across many, many years.
It's really an honor. I'm very, very grateful for the invitation. It was a delight to be invited and fun to be in dialogue with you guys, and very critical issues. So really the honor is mine, the privilege and the pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Appreciate it. And I just posted the link to Danny's book that just came out, Impossible Takes Longer. Check it out, buy it on Amazon.
Yep.
Right. It doesn't matter if you
thanks so much to and thanks so much to Jeremy, my friend and colleague. It's always a pleasure. It's always fun to plan and lead these conversations with you. So Danny, thanks for being with us this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everybody.
Good night.